Greece doesn't depend on foreign finance very much. The borrowing by the Greek state is to repay debt. Of course, Greek banks depend on liquidity from the European Central Bank because particularly they've lost a lot of deposits. But then unilateral default together with exit would provide another source of liquidity. So both of these problems can be dealt with. They're not problems. It's not an issue. In one answer, in one word, Germany. I understand the usual arguments about lack of federal state or unitary state, lack of fiscal transfers. We can debate these issues, and they're all interesting and important. But they are not, for me, they're not the main reason for the problems and the instability of the Eurozone. A monetary union, to survive, requires one central rule to be kept, and that is a common rate of inflation. Countries must stick to the rate of inflation that the monetary authority dictates, so that prices across the union move at the same pace, and you don't get divergences of competitiveness. Because when you get divergences of competitiveness in a monetary union, you get deficits and surpluses, and that's the beginning of the end of the union when you get that. The single most important reason for the divergences of competitiveness has been Germany keeping wages low, wage restraint, keeping wages down, missing the target negatively, below, and therefore emerging as a vast export machine. That fundamental imbalance remains at the heart of the monetary union. The periphery, which had prices rising above the ECB target, has now by and large adjusted by crashing wages. But Germany remains below. The source of instability from Germany has not gone away, and therefore the union remains unstable. Even if Germany, though, began to pay higher wages and inflation in Germany went up, even so, it's too late now because competitiveness loss accumulates. Germany has had 15 years of this. It's impossible for countries in the periphery to catch up on this basis. They need to get out of the monetary union, they need to readjust exchange rates, they need to put their economy in different order, and then see what kind of monetary arrangements we can have in Europe. There are two levels on which this question can be answered. The first level is at the level of institutions, austerity policy, and those mechanisms. I believe that the balance of forces and the institutional outlook is so heavily entrenched in the monetary union and in the European Union that reform of this type is impossible. I don't believe that it will happen. I don't think that it's feasible. But there's more than that. Even if you could change six-pack, two-pack, growth and stability pact, and so on, even if you could do that, which you can't, but even if you could do that, I repeat, the real source of the problem is wage restraint in Germany and vast divergences in competitiveness. Given how things stand in Europe, the periphery of Europe in particular is trapped in a low growth equilibrium in which it's laden by debt, and it hasn't got enough exports and enough growth to pay its debts. It's a trap, and the only way out of a trap is just to break the trap and get out. I don't believe in conspiracies, and I don't believe that politics proceeds on the basis of some very clever people reading the future. Where are these people? I think it's a combination of factors, institutional mechanisms, ideological inertia, and then naked interest. Germany went through a significant debate in the 1990s how to incorporate East Germany and how to deal with the monetary union, which France wanted more than Germany. Germany then had a debate, and in this debate in the late 90s, what was decided was that all the gains of productivity will go to capital and labor would be left out, because in this way labor would protect, presumably, employment. The trade unions agreed to this. Now, when this deal was struck, I don't believe that anyone understood the broader significance of it at the time. But obviously, in the monetary union, doing this and keeping prices down, because that's the implication of this, gave Germany a huge competitive advantage. Once the reality of that emerged in the 2000s, and Germany began to accumulate huge surpluses, then the German elite understood, and they wanted it. Then it became policy. And we're doing very well. And we went through this difficult period. We managed it, you do the same. It's impossible to do the same. This was a one-off. But from the perspective of Germany, it seems plausible. So it then became policy. But that's how I understand it, you know. It's time for the left and for political economists to begin to think in a more rounded fashion about this. In 2010, 2011, it would have been possible for Greece, Spain, possibly Portugal, to default unilaterally and to exit, restructure the economy, and deal with the crisis as it emerged in a better way than they have done. I firmly believe that the social cost would have been much less. These economies would have gone back into growth fairly soon. It didn't happen. Yes, but now we've had 6 years. This is a different situation. Default and exit now are not enough. We've got a situation in which these economies have been very badly hit, particularly Greece. It's a social and economic disaster, but also Spain has been badly hit, and Portugal. They're not going anywhere, these economies particularly. And we've got a situation in which the monetary union has become even harder. The question then for us now, I think, is more complex. Default and exit are necessary, but they're only a part of the picture. Now we need different policies that re-establish sovereignty. We need to rethink economic, political, and national sovereignty in Europe today. It has now become a much more difficult and much more complex issue. The Maastricht Treaty is obviously a landmark. These things are rarely associated with one event. It's not as if there is a single threshold. But clearly in the early 1990s, things began to change. And this idea of united Europe, of becoming more Europe, more integration, an inexorable march of more and more and more of something, began to gain influence and weight. So it's about 20, 25 years that this emerged in a big way. And now we see the results. The tragedy isn't so much that some people in power began to think that way. Big banks, big business, big interests. The tragedy is that the left also began to accept that. And it began to see in this march of Europe, the march of the future, that that's it. You know, we have discovered the new promise, and particularly because it appeared to transcend the nation state. And the European left has learned to consider everything to do with the nation state as bad. And therefore this was good. So what we've got to do is create a Europe of the movements, Europe of this, Europe of that. And we didn't see what was actually happening. And what's happening is not the Europe of the movements, it's not the Europe of freedom, it's a much more complex thing. It's the Europe of big business. The left should remember that, and it should plan its policies accordingly. Quite clearly, the last 6 years, in particular, have seen a range of policies adopted by the European Union and the Monetary Union that have exacerbated tensions and increased nationalist pressure. We saw this between Greece and Germany throughout this period, when both countries have called each other some terrible things in the course of this crisis. But now we see similar things across the East, to do with immigration, to do with refugees, and so on. Again, it's the policies of the European Union, the imposition of big business interests, and the lack of a true core of solidarity. This is not true internationalism in the way in which I would understand it. And this is not true alliance of people. This is big business creating an environment in which it can thrive, and it talks the language of solidarity, and we see the results. If you simply talk the language of solidarity, you don't get the reality. This will continue. This will continue. It's very difficult to reverse that. And the monetary union makes it worse. That's why I'm saying the left needs to find a language of sovereignty, which is not nationalism, and on this basis propose some new and genuine internationalism to Europe. I'll talk about the French government, what I understand. I mean, France is in a terrible state right now. It cannot compete with Germany. It cannot survive in the monetary union the way things are. There's no scope for growth. The pressures and the tensions will keep increasing on France in the coming period, and I don't really know what the French elite will do, because their options are very few. But the pressure is on France and Italy at the moment. So I really don't envy the French elite. They made the calculation with the monetary union, and it was the worst calculation in a very long time that a powerful group has made in Europe. The Greek political elite made a different calculation here. Tsipras in particular, it's not so much that he didn't really hope that the Germans wouldn't notice. I think these people genuinely believed that if they put together a good argument that said, look, austerity is a bad thing, everybody knows that. Why don't you give us a break? And once the economy is back on its feet, we will pay you, or we will be okay, and everybody will be happier. They thought that if they put this argument across, they would be dealing with reasonable people who would say, yes, okay, I see now, fine, we will give you some time. In other words, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. They were simple and ignorant. And when they went there, they realized fairly rapidly that these are the negotiators were hard, very clever, very well informed, and they weren't going to give an inch in economics or in politics. And then they panicked. Then the Greeks panicked. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know which way to go. They waited. And if you simply wait without doing anything, you will lose. And then they lost. It's as simple as that. I don't think the Germans were obdurate. The Germans were very clever, mature, experienced European politicians. They saw these so-called radicals come to Europe without really understanding what Europe was about, and without a credible threat. Tsipras and his group never had a credible threat. When you go and negotiate, you must have a credible threat to put on the table. Tsipras had from the beginning said, I'm not getting out of the monetary union. Well, if you're not going to do that, you've got no credible threat. Nothing. The Germans saw that. They saw that they were inexperienced and they had no threat. So they just waited. I did actually say that openly at the time. I had no role. I didn't advise Tsipras or anybody like that. They avoided me because I was too dangerous. But I argued it openly in the press and elsewhere. Greece had two options if it wanted more successful negotiation. The first option was to try and create some kind of front with Italy and France, on the grounds that Italy and France had more of an interest than Greece in changing austerity. I didn't believe that this was very hopeful, but at least they could have tried. Push the Germans in that way. That was the first thing. More fundamental than that, the only real credible threat is to have a plan of exit. To have a plan of exit that would be well worked out and to be frank about it and to have popular support when it came to putting it into operation. That was the only option they had. They could have imposed capital controls. Today is the 20th of February. It's exactly 1 year since the Greek government signed the first agreement. It was signed by Yannis Varoufakis, actually. The first agreement, which basically led to the surrender, saying we will honor the debt, we will not take any unilateral action, and so on. Instead of signing that, they could have imposed capital controls. They could have tightened the situation in the domestic financial system and could have started developing an exit plan. That would have been a credible threat. All serious studies that I know indicate that the medium-term results of exit would be beneficial for working people. I know of no study that doesn't show that. Therefore, in the medium term, working people and just about everybody else will benefit. The problem is short-term pressure. There's a complex array of factors that have to be taken into account. Purchasing power will be, to a certain extent, lost on deposits, but it will be gained on debts. The people never talk about that. The value of debts will also decline. So it's give and take. There'll be pressures on oil, energy, food and medicine. There'll be a period of temporary difficulties, a recession to start with, until the economy recovers. All that would require state intervention to lessen it. So this will be a period of difficulty of several months, 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, until the economy begins to pick up again. It's a matter of preparation and policy intervention to lessen the pressure. The left must learn to break with simply putting a label on things and making something bad because we don't like the label. Martin Feldstein advanced a very powerful critique of the monetary union. He was right. Right? I mean, he was right. I'm sorry to say, but he was right. That doesn't mean that I agree with his medicine or the way, what he suggested about, what he usually suggests about the economy, but his diagnosis was right. It's a fact. Now, arguments by the left, political economy arguments on the euro issue were not of very high quality to start with. People were confused, didn't quite grasp what was happening. And even now, when one talks about divergences of competitiveness to do with nominal unit labor costs, inflation in other words, a lot of people on the left get angry. It's not competitiveness, and it's not to do with unit labor costs, it's other things. They think that they're defending the rights of working people and so on. Economics is economics, right? We've got to recognize and read the situation for what it is. European Monetary Union has suffered from diverging inflations which have to do with diverging unit labor costs. Having said this, which the mainstream might also say. The question is, how do you fix it? What do you do about it? The mainstream said, lower the wages of the periphery. Political economy argument would have been a different policy, raising wages in Germany maybe, a Keynesian boost of expenditure, or getting out. That would have been a far more radical argument. And that's where radicalism begins to show, because then you propose other things for economy. It's not a different economics that we need. Okay? The economy is what it is. We analyze it, and then we draw conclusions.